let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we're tracing the chilling geographic and chronological itinerary of Adolf Hitler. We're going to look really closely at the exact path he walked, because we need to understand how on earth a fringe extremist actually managed to maneuver his way into orchestrating a total global catastrophe.
Just look at this stark juxtaposition. I mean, it brilliantly illustrates our whole focus today. On one side, you've got Vienna in 1910, a 21-year-old homeless guy painting postcards just to survive in a men's shelter. And then on the other, Berlin, 1945, literally the most blood-stained dictator in human history. So how does a marginalized nobody with zero prospects transform into the absolute architect of the 20th century's most murderous conflict? Let's figure it out.
Here's the roadmap we're going to follow. Number 1, from nobody to radical. 2, seizing absolute power. 3, igniting the global cataclysm. 4, architect of the Holocaust. And 5, the bunker and the ashes.
Okay, let's kick things off with Section 1, from nobody to radical. You know, after completely failing to enter the Vienna Academy of Fine Arts, which was a huge humiliation that he actively tried to hide, Hitler lived this kind of bohemian lifestyle that eventually landed him in homeless shelters. He had absolutely zero direction in life until he finally found purpose as a courier in the German army. And it is so crucial to understand this point. His time in the military gave him his very first real sense of belonging. The army essentially became his family. Because of that incredibly tight bond, Germany's sudden defeat in 1918 wasn't just a loss, it was an absolute perspective-shattering trauma for him. Completely unable to process it, he desperately sought out a scapegoat. And well, that brings us to a truly chilling piece of evidence. The final objective must be the removal of the Jews. This is straight from a typed letter Adolf Hitler wrote back in August 1919, which was right after he became a military propagandist. What's so interesting and horrifying about this document is that it proves his genocidal blueprint wasn't some late, desperate development during the war. No, his obsessive hatred was explicitly laid out right at the very beginning of his political awakening. Moving right along to Section 2, seizing absolute power. If we look at the years between 1919 and 1933, we see a really distinct shift in his tactics. Back in 1919, he joins the tiny German Workers' Party. Fast forward to 1923, and he tries to take over the Bavarian government by brute force in the failed Munich Putsch. He gets arrested, and in 1924, he sits in a pretty comfortable prison cell writing Mein Kampf. But the main takeaway for us here is that after prison, he realized brute violence alone just wasn't going to cut it. Instead, he completely shifted to exploiting the democratic process itself. By leveraging the massive economic desperation of the 1929 Great Depression, he promised people bread and work, and he eventually maneuvered his way into becoming chancellor in 1933. Once he actually got inside the government, the dismantling of democracy was, well, it was terrifyingly fast. Step 1, he uses the 1933 Reichstag fire as a convenient pretext to claim there's a communist plot. Step 2, he forces the suspension of key civil liberties. Step 3, he pushes through the Enabling Act, which basically allows his cabinet to bypass parliament entirely. And finally, Step 4, he ruthlessly purges his own paramilitary, the SA, just to secure the total loyalty of the traditional army. In just a matter of months, he systematically tore down the Republic's institutions to forge a totalitarian dictatorship. It was breathtakingly fast. All right, let's look at Section 3, igniting the global cataclysm. So from his remote alpine retreat in Bavaria, a place called the Berghof, Hitler masterfully stage-managed his foreign policy. He'd invite world leaders up there and project this carefully crafted image of a peaceful, approachable statesman. But you know, behind the scenes, he was secretly rearming Germany in direct, blatant violation of international treaties. He went on to annex Austria, notoriously broke the 1938 Munich Agreement, and then finally invaded Poland in September 1939. And that invasion, as we know, is what officially sparked World War II. He managed to achieve this terrifying early military success through blitzkrieg. Think of it as a lightning war military tactic. It relies on massive coordinated air support combined with rapid tank movements to just completely crush the enemy. This devastating new tactic allowed him to conquer Poland in mere weeks, and then actually force France to surrender by June 1940. I mean, achieving in 6 weeks what Germany couldn't do in 4 whole years during World War I, that completely deluded Hitler into believing he was some sort of infallible military genius. But as the war expanded, so did his paranoia. Actually, he didn't even lead from the capital in Berlin anymore. Instead, he started directing this massive globe-spanning conflict from a series of heavily fortified, completely isolated forest bunkers. We're talking places like Brûlé de Pêche in Belgium, to the heavily mined Wolf's Lair in Poland, all the way to Vinnytsia in Ukraine. So the man who once absolutely craved the spotlight of those giant rallies became a dictator hunkered down in the shadows, getting increasingly disconnected from the actual realities of the war.
Let's turn now to Section 4, Architect of the Holocaust.
As he pushed his armies eastward into the Soviet Union in 1941, the violence escalated catastrophically with the Einsatzgruppen. These were special death squads that literally followed the German army, and they were directly responsible for mass shootings of Jews and political opponents. These mobile killing units marked a brutally horrific escalation in his anti-Semitic policies, and it's just a staggering fact to wrap your head around that they were responsible for roughly 40% of all Holocaust victims.
And then there was a sickening shift in methodology. On January 20, 1942, the Wannsee Conference formalized what they chillingly called the final solution. They drafted a report explicitly targeting 11 million European Jews for systematic extermination. The regime methodically transitioned from those mass shootings to actual industrial murder factories like Auschwitz. And honestly, what is perhaps most chilling about this meticulously organized slaughter is that Hitler orchestrated all of these horrors without ever once setting foot in a concentration camp himself. 65 million. I just want you to pause and think about that number. This is the estimated death toll of his 6-year war. It is a staggering, almost incomprehensible figure, and of course it includes the methodical extermination of 6 million Jews. It's a permanent, devastating scar on human history, entirely driven by the dark obsession of one man. Which brings us to our final part, Section 5, the bunker and the ashes. After a series of disastrous miscalculations and the totally devastating surrender of his army at Stalingrad in February 1943, the whole myth of his invincibility was finally broken. Then came the Allied landings in Normandy in June 1944. So the once highly mobile dictator was now entirely hunkered down underground. As the Allies and the Soviets closed in from literally all sides, it led directly to his suicide in the Berlin bunker in April 1945. So the really crucial question we have to ask is, did he show any remorse at the very end? Absolutely not. On April 29, 1945, in his final political testament, a physically declining Hitler blames the officers, the German people, and most of all, the Jews for his defeat. He actually took pride in the Holocaust and actively urged his successors to continue the mass murder. Deep underground, marrying Eva Braun just hours before they took their own lives, he remained completely 100% unrepentant. What's really fascinating here is the incredibly bizarre post-mortem odyssey of his remains. On April 30, 1945, his body was burned in the Reich Chancellery Garden, which was exactly what he had ordered. Soviet forces autopsied and identified the remains pretty shortly after. But get this, from 1945 all the way to 1970, Joseph Stalin actively hid this truth, just as sowed geopolitical confusion and fear among the Western Allies. The remains were actually buried and dug up 9 different times before the Soviets finally burned them completely and threw the ashes off a bridge in Baderitz in 1970. They totally eradicated him from the map. And that brings us to our final thought. How can modern democracies recognize and prevent such manipulative ascents to power today? As we wrap up this explainer, we've seen exactly how a marginalized nobody manipulated institutions, exploited economic fear, and weaponized pure hatred to orchestrate the deadliest conflict in human history. We really have to ask ourselves how we can actively protect our own institutions from those who would exploit societal vulnerabilities. We have to ensure a monster like this is never, ever made again. Thanks for joining me on this deep dive, and as always, keep asking the big questions.